This is our last week of a series we've been doing called Do-Over, how to have a fresh start with God. And so I think when we think about do-overs, when we think about fresh starts, it's been really encouraging over the last 3 weeks to hear stories of people who want a do-over. There's something in their life they just don't like, or there's something that's been a part of their life that has really kind of messed them up. And they're like, I want a do-over. And I've heard all kinds of amazing stories of things that people want some freedom from. And they want to make some things in their past and kind of restore their present. And with every story that I hear from someone, there's something that sticks in my mind. And I have this in my mind as well, because as I've shared, I'm in the middle of a do-over right now, trying to get a little healthier. That's why I was out on a bike ride the other day. So I think I'm going to have to stay on a recumbent bike at the gym for a little while because of this guy. But I'm trying to get a little healthier, so I'm looking at a do-over here. But I think there's one thing for every one of us who wants a do-over. There is one thing that we fear. There's one thing that haunts us whenever we think of this, and that's falling back into old habits. I think every one of us, when we try to start something new, when we try to have a fresh start, there's that underlying fear. What if I go back? What if I start smoking again? What if I start eating unhealthy stuff again versus healthy stuff? What if I get back to exercise, then I quit again? Or what if I get back, I'm really trying to not drink as much, and what if you go out and you get hammered again and you just feel lost? You feel like a failure. I think that fear haunts all of us if you've ever tried to have a do-over. And the truth is, there's good reason for that fear. Because when you look at recovery rates of habits and addictions are unfortunately pretty low. It's pretty grim. No matter what you look at, whether it's drug and alcohol addiction, gambling, smoking, porn, weight loss, almost no matter what the addictive behavior is, that the relapse rate, in other words, the rate of going back to the thing you're trying to get healed of, it's pretty grim. The stats range from researchers, the stats range of the relapse rate is 50 to 90%. That means 50 to 90%, and it kind of varies depending on each one. Gambling actually has one of the highest rates of relapse. So if you've ever wanted a reason not to go to the casino, know that is an addiction that is one of the hardest to break out of all the other addictions, which is pretty astounding if you know anything about meth. Okay? Gambling can actually even be harder to quit. And so the recovery rates, it's really hard. That means most of the people, a majority of the people who start a do-over, undo their do-over. I certainly have. I've lost weight, some good amount of weight at different points in my life, and I've gained it back eventually. And maybe you've had that cycle before. Whatever your habit is, maybe you've picked it back up again. And so I think that's something that we all fear. That's this haunting message of, what if you go back? And there's another interesting thing when you look at recovery stats. If you make it past a year, then that 50 to 90% relapse rate about cuts in half. In other words, you have a lot better chance. If you could make it a whole year of healthy eating, or a whole year of not smoking, or a whole year of not drinking, you have a lot higher chance. And then, this is amazing, if you can make it 2 years, then the recovery rates are really, really high. In other words, that you have such a good chance of being able to stick with the do-over. So how do we do that? How do we make it to that 1 year mark, to that 2 year mark, where the odds are more in our favor? Because if you're at day one, you just need to understand the odds aren't in your favor. Now, thankfully, we have a God who beats odds. So we have a source of power and strength and ability that some people don't when they're trying to beat their addictions. But how do we make it to that year one? How do we, in a sense, prevent disaster? And that's kind of the idea for today, is I want to tell you about one of the many secrets, but one of the big secrets to protecting yourself from disaster. And for this, for do-overs, I call disaster undoing your do-over. So if that's you, we want to learn how to protect that. We want to learn how not to go back. How not to go back to the drinking, to the smoking, to the using, whatever it is, to the shopping, spending on credit cards, to the bad eating, to the lying, to whatever it is you want to do over for, how do we not go back? Because the odds are not in our favor. Right? How do you protect yourself from disaster? Well, I think there are a lot of answers to that, and there are a lot of good answers to that. I'm only going to give one answer to that. Okay? There are a lot of good answers to this. There are a lot of bad answers, but there are also a lot of good answers. But I'm going to give one answer because it's an answer that the Israelites gave. The Israelites realized while they were in the middle of their do-over. Okay? So if you remember the story, we've been talking about the Israelites as one of the great do-overs in Bible history. So if you've been around a few weeks, then you've heard a little bit about this. If you're new, if this is week 1, I'll give you sort of the 2-minute update. Here it is. So the Israelites were God's chosen people. God raised them out of slavery. He gave them the law, what we might call our Bible. They gave them the law to transform this slave race into a people of God. And then the Israelites followed God for a while and did great. And then things started to go south. And things went really, really bad. They disobeyed God. They turned their back on God. They started worshiping and sacrificing to other gods, and it got horrible. So God punished them. God withdrew his presence, and he allowed them to be taken captive by their enemies. It was the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Persians. It was 3 different groups over the years, if you remember back to your high school history classes. And so what God did was he allowed them to be taken captive. For 70 years, they were taken away from their home. The city of Jerusalem was destroyed. It was leveled. Their temple destroyed, burned to the ground. So there was nothing left. And then after those 70 years, God freed them. He released them. And a couple weeks ago, we talked about the first wave of people who came back. And it's a great do-over. If you think about that, going back to your hometown and it is in rubble. And they were released, they're walking back, and here they are. They literally have to start from scratch. And so we talked about the first group of people and a couple of their leaders, Zerubbabel, who was kind of like a governor, and then Joshua, who was like a priest. They went back, and amidst this rubble of rock, the first thing they did was they built an altar and they offered sacrifices. Because that was how sacrifices were, how God had instructed them to ask forgiveness. That was the means, those sacrifices. So the first thing they did, and this is from about 3 weeks ago, the first thing they did was they admitted what they did was wrong. They admitted what the Bible calls sin. And through those sacrifices, God forgave their sin. It was the first thing you do. And that's the first step of a do-over. The first step of a do-over is you've got to admit what you've done is wrong. And you've got to fess up. And now, thankfully, we don't have to kill and slaughter and burn animals for our sacrifices. Because when Jesus Christ died on the cross, he died as the last final sacrifice. The sacrifice for all of us and everyone else. And so we don't have to sacrifice an animal. We can turn to Jesus and say yes to Jesus. Jesus, I believe you died on the cross for me. I believe I can be forgiven of my sins because of you. And that's what believing in Jesus Christ is all about. So that's the first thing you've got to do in a do-over. The second thing and if you missed any of these, you can find these sermons up online at riverlifemn.com/sermons. They're all up there. You can get all caught up on the do-over series. So the second thing you had to do, and the second thing the Israelites did, was there were still a bunch of them in captivity, in slavery. And then God released a second group of people to come home. And they were led by a guy named Ezra. And if that name sounds familiar, you might have seen it in your Bible table of contents or in your Bible app, because there's a book named after him. Those are the books that we're studying, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. So Ezra was a priest, and he was a great priest. He was the priest of all priests. And so Ezra began this process of aligning the Israelites' life with God's desire for their life. In other words, they cleaned house. And that's step 2 in a do-over, is you've got to clean house. There's stuff in your life you've just got to get rid of. Whether it's you delete that folder of porn on your computer, or you cancel some accounts online, you cut up some credit cards, you stop going to the club, you cut up your Mystic Lake loyalty cards. Whatever it is that you just got to clean house. You cancel some subscriptions. And that's what Ezra did. He started to clean house. And fundamentally what it is, it's aligning your own life with God's desire for your life. Sin is fundamentally being out of alignment of those two things. And aligning and following God is saying, okay, I've got to get my life lined up with what God wants for my life. And that's the second step. And we see that all throughout the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. And we see it some more in the book of Nehemiah that we're going to talk about today. So those are the first couple steps. But now the third step. What came next in this process? What came next? Well, God raises up another leader, because there's still some people who are in exile. And so actually 3 groups of people, 3 waves of people. Kind of think of it like the Hmong immigrants to America. There was one big wave in the mid-70s, another big wave in the 80s, and then another big wave actually recently when they closed down the refugee camps. That was kind of what it was like. 3 big waves of Israelite refugees coming back home. And this group was led by a guy named Nehemiah. And we're going to learn a little bit about Nehemiah, but Nehemiah was kind of like a governor. So sort of like Zerubbabel earlier, but Nehemiah was kind of the man on the scene now. And he was pretty smart. He must have been pretty good, because even when he was a slave, he held one of the highest positions a slave could hold. It was called the cupbearer to the king. So in other words, he's the guy who would take wine to the king. And often he'd be the guy who'd have to drink it in case it was poisoned. So if someone was trying to kill the king, then it's usually the cupbearer who ends up getting killed. But that was it. And it's a huge, because you're sitting right next to the king. You have access to the king. Not like those other guys who are back in the rooms and locked out. No. You have access to the king. And we're going to see how Nehemiah used his access to the king for good, for the cause of the Israelites. So that's what we're going to look at today. So we're going to look at the book of Nehemiah, because this is the continuation of the Israelite do-over story. We talked about Ezra for the first couple weeks, and now we're going to talk about Nehemiah. And it's a big book. I mean, there are like 12, 13 chapters in it. We're going to jump through a few of the sections. Some of it we'll read, some of it I'll just describe, because I want to make sure you kind of get the whole story. But otherwise, we'd be here till like 3 o'clock if I did the whole book. That'd just be too much. Okay? So we're going to talk about Nehemiah. And we're going to begin at the beginning of the book of Nehemiah. It's chapter 1, verses 1 to 3. And I know normally I stand off to the side because I know I'm kind of big and I can stand, and I hold my tablet in one hand, but I can't quite pull that off. So I'm gonna leave my tablet here, and I'll move a lot so you could read around me. I apologize for that, but I can't quite hold and swipe at the same time. So we'll see how this works out. So we're gonna read Nehemiah chapter 1, the very beginning, verses 1 to 3. We're gonna start there. Here we go. The words of Nehemiah, son of Hilkiah, in the month of Kislev, which is about November and December. It's the Hebrew month. It's about our November and December. In the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa. Okay, we'll pause there. So Susa is the winter kingly home of the king of Persia. So he's out in Susa. Also, so he's out there. He's living out there far away from Jerusalem. That's the city of Susa. Okay? Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah, which is the region where Jerusalem is. In other words, his brother came from Jerusalem up to Susa to see him. Came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant, in other words, the Jews who were still there, that had survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem. Be like, so, give me an update. How are things down there? I've been out of it for a while, so how are things? Here's what they said. They said to me, those who survived the exile are back in the province and in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. So that was their report, that it's in pretty bad shape. So not just did they destroy the city and destroy the temple, but they destroyed the walls. Okay? So they visit. So how's it going? Not really good. The walls are all broken down. Okay, now we have to talk a little bit about walls here for a sec. That in the ancient world, walls for a city are really important. They're very important because walls protected a city. In fact, every major city had walls. You needed them because otherwise anybody could just come on in here and destroy your city. And people were always attacking people right and left back then. So you needed walls. That's why it's a big deal when the walls were crumbled down. Okay? So let's kind of continue the story. So the rest of chapter 1 is Nehemiah heartbroken over this. He cries, he mourns, he fasts, and then he prayed. He prayed for God's favor because you could kind of tell in this prayer he made a decision. He was going to ask the king for a favor. And slaves don't ask kings for favor. You know what slaves get when they ask for a favor of the king? They get the sword. So he prayed. He confessed on behalf of Israel. He confessed the sins. And his heart broke and he cried out and he also said, let me find favor with the king. And so then the next day, as he was delivering wine to the king, he asked the king, could you release me to go back to my homeland? I am in sorrow. And the king even noticed, the king asked, he said, you're normally not sad. Why are you sad today? And then Nehemiah responded, my hometown is in shambles. The walls are broken. May I be released to go down to fix it, to lead, to repair these walls. And amazingly, the king said yes, because that's finding favor from God. The king said yes, and not even that. He said, yes, you go down, and you know what? I'm going to send you with money. I'm going to give you letters of permission so you can go get wood from the forest. You can go get stones from the quarry. You'll get anything you need. I'll send you with the kingly letters to get you all the supplies you need. And so Nehemiah went home. So Nehemiah left Susa and then walked down, traveled with another group of people to Jerusalem. And so he landed in Jerusalem. And that's where the story picks up in chapter 2, 11 and 12. So we'll read that. Chapter 2, 11 and 12. I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with just a few others. I had not told anyone what my God had put on my heart to do for Jerusalem. So he's keeping this on the down low. But he comes in Jerusalem, and then in the middle of the night, he decides to go for a walk. And what he does on this walk is he actually walks the walls. So let me give you a little visual of what this might have looked like. Here's a picture of a model of Jerusalem. This is actually in Israel. It's a scale model, obviously not full scale. Otherwise, those would be giants over there. Okay, but you can kind of see a scale model of Jerusalem. Over in the bottom right-hand corner, that's the temple. To the left of that was the original city. So the earliest city of King David, if you know him from the Old Testament, this region right over here is the city of David. So that's where it all started, and then it grew and grew and grew. So this is probably a little bigger than it was at Nehemiah's time, but you can kind of picture that all in rubble. That's a good guess of what it looked like in Nehemiah's time. And you can see if you look around the bottom, there's the wall. Okay? There's a whole wall going all the way around the city. Okay? And here's a close-up of what a wall looks like. Here's another shot. So that's kind of, and again, this is a scale model, okay? So there's a wall, and you can see over there, that's kind of what a gate would look like. And those gates would be wooden, because obviously you're not going to be swinging giant stone gates. So they're wooden gates. That's why the gates they always talk about were burned with fire. The stones were crumbled and the gates were burned with fire. So here's an example of what those walls might have looked like. Okay, in this next one, here's a giant, let's get that next one up here. Here's a giant crow attacking Jerusalem. This is the real reason. No, it's actually just an awesome picture because it's a normal-sized crow and with a tiny model of Jerusalem. Okay, so let's pull up one picture and I'll actually show you where Nehemiah walked because it's pretty cool. So this part probably didn't exist in Nehemiah's time, but this part did. So the rest of chapter 2 talks about where he walked. They actually talk about the gates he walked out of, the walls he walked out of, and we could tell he walked out of the bottom. This is a pool, so the passage talks about a kingly pool. That's actually a pool for bathing and washing and stuff. And so he walked out this gate and then walked over this direction to your right. And this valley, this one was called the Kidron Valley. And then you can see, or you can tell from the text that he walked up this valley, somewhere up toward the top, and then he walked down, back down the valley, and back down to the gate down here. Why did he do this? Why did he take this midnight stroll on the DL and only bring a few people with him? He did it because he wanted to look at the wall. He wanted to see it firsthand because he had just heard stories. So I can imagine him walking. Imagine walking and his glorious city of Jerusalem was in shambles and the walls were all crumbled down. And I can imagine him walking, going up and kind of shaking some stones and walking over here and kicking a few of them. And I could just imagine his heart breaking as he was walking and surveying the damage to this wall. Notice he did that before he ever proposed anything. He didn't even tell people yet why he was there. Because he wanted to survey the wall. He wanted to get an honest picture of the reality ahead of him. And you know what? And I think that's a really wise thing to do. And I think every do-over requires us to kind of walk the walls of ourselves. And I don't think it's any coincidence that one of the most successful do-over organizations has fundamental to its process walking the walls of yourself and your life. Many of you have probably heard of Alcoholics Anonymous. They're most famous for their 12-step program. This program has been replicated to almost any addiction you can find. You can find a 12-step program. And it probably has the highest success rate of any other of the recovery programs. It's been one of the most long-standing, most well-respected recovery programs was Alcoholics Anonymous. And in these 12 steps they have one step in there. It's step 4. So it's pretty early in the process. Step 4 says this: make a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. Make a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. You know what that means? We got to walk the walls. We got to walk the walls and be honest about how messed up our life has become. No sugarcoating, no lying to yourself, no pretending it's not as bad as it really is. To make a searching, and I love the fact that they include fearless moral inventory of ourselves. And every do-over requires that. Nehemiah knew it. He knew he had to get an honest picture of the walls. And so I think if you're in a do-over right now, one of the things you got to do is make a searching and fearless moral inventory of your life, or of your health, or of your marriage. And you got to be honest. No BSing God on this one. No BSing yourself. No lying to the family and minimizing. You got to be honest. So that's what Nehemiah did. He walked the walls. So he had an honest picture of basically how destroyed they were. Because it wasn't about were they destroyed. It's the how destroyed. Then here's where he takes off. Okay? Still in chapter 2, verse 17, he goes, he collects up all the officials, the leaders, the elders, all of that, and here's what he says. Then I said to them, you see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. They replied, let us start rebuilding. So they began this good work. They didn't need much convincing. They knew they were in trouble. And I think anybody in the middle of a do-over knows they're in trouble. Their marriage is in trouble. Their job, their career is in trouble. Their health is in trouble. They knew they were in trouble. So they said, let's do it. And then all of chapter 3 is this pretty cool chapter because it talks about all the people who were building. And it's great. It's amazing. It talks about people, all kinds of people, men and women, who were helping rebuild this wall. So they have a whole chapter full of starting of rebuilding. So it starts out really well. And then it kind of takes a turn for the worse. Right? Because starting in chapter 4, they begin to encounter some opposition. From two guys in particular, a guy named Sanballat and another guy named Tobiah. These guys were just punks. They were from one of the neighboring enemy groups, and they tried everything possible to prevent them, thank you, hon, to prevent them from completing the wall. They lied, they threatened, they manipulated, they pretended they were his friends only to try to trap him. And every single time Nehemiah was like, no. They're like, here, let's go to this coffee shop and talk over what we're doing and go down this dark alley. They're like, no. Okay? And then what in one of my favorite scenes, they actually trash talk him. Okay? So this guy Tobiah, we don't really know much about him other than he's from one of the enemy cities and he was some type of official. He has one of the best trash talks in the entire Bible. Okay? You want to learn trash talk? Follow Tobiah, because here's what, they come up and they see the wall and they start mocking, be like, what is this? You call this a wall? And here's what Tobiah says. He says, what? This thing's so puny, if a fox were to jump onto it, it would collapse. That's some Old Testament trash talk for you right there. So next time, guys, gals, next time you're like playing basketball or something, and someone's trash talking you, be like, dude, your game's so weak. If a fox were to hop onto it, it'd collapse. Okay, maybe that's not good trash talk, but it was pretty good for back then. So these guys tried everything to get them to stop rebuilding, and it's really interesting. Because a lot of the people that I've talked to over the past month who are in the middle of a do-over have shared with me somebody in their life who was not happy they were doing a do-over. Sometimes it's coworkers who start teasing them or getting on their case or trying to stop them. Why are you doing that? Why did you come? Or maybe it's your drinking buddies. Maybe it's your clubbing group. Where the ones you used to go out with and you're trying not to, and now they're trashing. Maybe they're spreading lies about you. Or maybe they're calling you names. Maybe they're trying to destroy your reputation, just like these guys, Sanballat and Tobiah, tried to do. But every single time, Nehemiah said, no, I will not fall down here. I have to keep going because this is a good work. So for 3 chapters, there was opposition. In fact, it got so bad, it even describes that these guys had a tool in one hand, like a hammer in one hand, and a sword in the other. That's how bad it got, because at any moment, the enemies could come and attack. They actually had to split their crew up, so half the crew was working on the rocks, and half the crew was guarding them with swords. That's how bad it got. So honestly, if you ever think a do-over is easy, it's not. Somebody, maybe it's a family member who's giving you a hard time. You're trying to kind of clean something up in your life, and your whole family is against you because, I don't know, maybe they're all using as well. And you're trying to quit. You're trying to get clean. So you will face opposition. I need to tell you that. You will face opposition. And that's why it's even more important to have people around you who believe in what you're doing. That's what Nehemiah did. He brought out more guards who believed in rebuilding the wall. He didn't surround himself with naysayers. He didn't surround himself with his enemies. He surrounded himself with people who believed in what they were doing. You need to also, because otherwise your do-over is not going to last long. Okay? And then what was amazing was, so after about 2 months, it starts in 7 and ends in about 10 or so, chapter 10. But over a course, it only took them 2 months to rebuild the wall of Jerusalem. 2 months, 59 days, that's all it took. And then after all of that work, resisting all of that opposition, all of that teamwork, they were in a city that was safe. And Jerusalem was protected. Jerusalem was safe from the cities. And this completing the wall really represented the completion of their do-over cycle. Okay? Now there's a little bit more to the story, but I'm going to hold off on that. I'm going to tell you that in a little bit. Because let's talk about walls. Let's talk about the walls that we need to protect ourselves from disaster. Because with every do-over, you're just one bad decision away from disaster. And I think most of us have probably been there. Just one bad decision. And then you feel defeated. You feel like a failure. You feel like you've lost hope. You feel like God's going to give up on you. Every one of us, even if you've been the good kid in your family, and one of your siblings was the bad kid, even if you've been the good kid, you're still just one decision away from disaster. So we need walls in our life. We need them, but what do they look like? Okay, we don't have cities with big giant stone walls anymore. Well, we have houses with walls and fences, but that's not quite the same. Okay? So don't take from this message that you need to go like repair the wood fence in your backyard, although that's probably a good idea, okay? Or fix the locks on your door. Still probably a good idea, but not quite what God's going for with this story. What are the walls in our life? What are the walls that would protect you from disaster? Okay. So what is a wall for us? Well, here's one example. This is a wall. This is protecting me from disaster. Because if I were to do this without this fiberglass splint on, you would hear me screaming like you've never heard me before, because that would hurt. This splint is protecting me from disaster. So in a sense, this splint is a little wall for my broken wrist. Ow, that one hurt. Okay, make sure to poke only the splint portion, okay? So this is an example of a wall. Okay? What about you? What about your life? Think of the thing you want to do over in. What's a wall that you need to protect yourself? Well, because see, our do-overs have been all about habits, behaviors, and addictions. So it's likely that big stone walls aren't going to help us. So for our do-overs, here's how I define a wall. Here's how you might think of a wall. Is anything that will protect you from the habits, behaviors, and addictions that have hurt you in the past. Think about it. Is that a coyote? So think about that. That a wall is anything that will protect you from the habits, behaviors, or addictions that hurt you in the past. If something falls under that category, it's a wall for you. And as I've thought about walls in our life, I've come up with 3 categories that I think they could fall into. Probably a majority of walls can fall into one of these categories. Okay? First is locations. Maybe you just got to stop going to clubs. If when you go out, if you get hammered or you hook up or you start doing things that you don't want to keep doing, maybe you just got to stop going to clubs. Okay? Not that I believe clubs are inherently evil. Although it's filled with a bunch of evil stuff, clubs in and of themselves are not inherently evil. But if they're a bad place for you, yeah, then stay away from them. Okay? Or maybe it's bars or house parties. Maybe you like to go out and drink, and you got to stay away from these places with the 36 packs and the kegs and the hard liquor and all of that. So locations. Okay? Some of you or some of us, we just got to stay out of McDonald's. Stay out of the drive-thru, none of that. No Culver's special for lunch. We just got to stay out of some of those places. Okay? Or for some of you, you got to just stay out of the mall. Just don't go there. Stay home. Okay? Places. There are locations that will help us. Staying away from locations could protect us from disaster. Okay? So that's the first category of wall, is think about locations. Another category of wall is think about friends. For some of you, there are some friends you have that are hurting you. These friends are not helping your life. They're giving you a really fun time, but they are not helping you. And while you're in recovery, you need to create some walls to separate yourself from these friends. And I'm not saying cut yourself out, but if you're one step away from disaster, you need to get away from friends who bring you to disaster. So for some of you, it's some friends where you just got to tell them, be like, hey, listen, I'm trying to quit this. I know all of you guys smoke, and I've been smoking. I'm trying to quit. Then I don't want to hang out with you on break anymore. It's not about you. It's not about you, it's about me, okay? But some of you have friends that you need to build some walls to separate yourself from. Okay, the third category of walls that I've seen are situations or circumstances. Okay? And another way, recovery ministry talks about these in terms of triggers. They're things that will trigger you wanting to go back. Okay? So some of you, when you're really stressed and you're having a fight with your spouse, that's when you look at porn. So you need to be really careful and honestly pretty scared when you get stressed and you have a fight with your spouse. A bad day at work. Maybe that's when you're most likely to go down and eat a whole gallon of cookie dough ice cream. Okay? Maybe, I don't know what your bad day of work thing is. Maybe you go shopping to reward yourself. You go eating, you go drinking, whatever it is. Then you need to be really careful on your bad days at work. And as you walk out to your car, you need to call a buddy of yours. Call a girlfriend and say, okay, this is going to be a really tough drive home because I don't want to go home right now. Can you stay on the phone with me for the next half hour while I'm driving? Okay? So situations. Some of you have situations that you need to build some walls around. So quite simply, I ask you, where do you need your walls? Where do you need walls? Because you will not pull off a do-over without some walls. Now, I want to tell you how the story ended for the Israelites. It's a pretty cool story by the end of Nehemiah, the book, because here it is, a restored people in a restored temple in a restored land. And that's what we want. We want to be a restored people in a restored church, in restored communities. And that's what we see with the Israelites. Because of all of these steps in their big do-over, God restored them. And they confessed and they worshiped and they threw this huge party. They actually put up giant choirs up on the wall. Not just one, but they set up 2 choirs. They set up bands and musicians, and the priests were priesting and the musicians were playing and people were reading the law and they were feasting. And it was an amazing celebration. And we see Israel restored for the first time in a good 1,000 years. And that's what I want for us. I want us to be a restored people. Because there's no such thing as an unhealthy church. It's just all made up of unhealthy people. And the healthier our people, the healthier our church. So I want us to be restored. I want us to have stories where we can tell that of our addictions and our habits are in our past, not our present, because of what God has done in us. I want us to be a restored people in a restored church, in restored communities, just like we saw in Israel. And so that's my desire for us. We got one more song here that we're going to close in, and one of the other interesting things that happened during this big celebration that they did was the priests, it describes that the priests purified the people and purified the walls and purified the temple. And it doesn't say how they did that, but one of the ways they might have done that is by something called anointing. So this thing called anointing is something that happened in the Old Testament a lot, and it was a very symbolic gesture. And what they took is that they took some oil, and they took a little jar of, well, they probably had a big jar of oil. They had a little jar of oil, and they anointed something, which is in a sense, to mark it as belonging to God. And mark it, for them, they were purifying the city. Okay? Because that was part of the role of the priest. Now here, because Jesus is our great high priest, it is not my role as pastor to purify you, thank goodness. That's God's role. But what we can do here is I can anoint you to mark you as belonging to God. So we got one more song here, and as they sing, we're going to mimic what the Israelites did. And if you would like to be anointed, I'm going to be down front here with some oil. This is just regular like olive oil, so don't worry about allergic reactions and stuff. And there's nothing special about this. This isn't magical oil. This isn't take this and you'll be healed. No, okay? But this is a symbolic gesture of taking this and marking you as belonging to God. And if you're in the middle of a do-over, this will be marking you and your do-over as belonging to God. So as we sing, go ahead and stand. We're going to sing here. I'm going to be down in front. If you would like to be anointed and marked, special, and set aside for God, I would love to do that. Kind of like the priests did with Nehemiah and the crew. I'm going to be down here doing this for you guys.